So, we've seen Schmecker. I will ask a couple of questions just by way of trying to contextualize the film. There are a number of ways in which the film can be situated in contexts that are not necessarily known or familiar to the audience, and then we will open it up to questions from you guys. I guess we could start on a kind of more macro or more micro level. One way is perhaps to situate the film a bit in relation to the context which I mentioned briefly when I was introducing you, and that is that in a kind of broader picture, the picture of Yugoslavia at the time. This is 1985. This is that period of interregnum where it's after, a few years after Josip Broz Tito had died. Things are changing, but very much the country is living as if nothing has changed. A few years ahead, the rise of nationalism, and eventually, very soon, in fact, in the early 90s, the collapse of the country. But Schmecker belongs, and it captures, I think, fairly well the spirit of the time, insofar, of course, as it pertains to certain strata of life in Belgrade. So maybe you can start by telling us, Belgrade at the time, the capital of Yugoslavia, still, now Serbia. Maybe you can just tell us a bit about those times as you see them in relation to making this film, or maybe retroactively, when you look at it now, what does it really capture, and where do we begin to locate it in the picture of Yugoslavia of the times?
I didn't see such a big image of this film for a long time, and some things I never actually saw before, to be honest. Some reaction, some micro thing that happened. What struck me most is exactly what you're talking about, because this film does not deal with nationalistic, but there is this strange angle to the army, to the almost theatrical power that army still had, even with the actor who is over the top in it, and it's almost
the representative of the army itself.
Yeah, yes. The officer, and it almost becomes search for identity. He repeats that name almost endlessly, you know. Am I really searching for the right person there? So in that sense, I think it was still the cushion of Yugoslavia. There was some bubble that still belonged there. But within that bubble, what exists is this theater. Nothing can happen outside of theater. Everybody watches everybody. That little backyard is always full of people who are witnessing the most private, you know, happenings within a family or within a relationship. And that was clear to me tonight, you know. Also, what I did 30 years ago, almost without thinking too much, now it becomes almost impossible to believe it happened back then, is insisting on the friendship between a white and a black guy. Black guy being a gypsy guy within the microcosmos of the Yugoslavia, and the white guy being Zoran, meaning father. Because it brings the question of friendship. I think ethics of every society have certain points. Family is one, but friendship is an extremely important one. And they discuss, they argue, they even clash about what a real friend should do. But there is no doubt that they are friends. And I think that was something that looked today almost impossible to understand. It almost looks sugar-coated as it is today. That for me, you know, there is some nostalgia that I had when I was young. I don't understand why, but there was already nostalgic sense of
some nostalgia in the present.
Yeah, nostalgia in the present.
It's interesting you mentioned, it struck me this time around too, the extent to which the role, the presence, the kind of overarching presence of the Yugoslav People's Army, the extent to which it's foregrounded in the film. It's almost as if the film is, I mean, one could read it from today's perspective as, which I think would be wrong, as anticipating a critique. But this was at the time when Yugoslav People's Army was, more than anything, still a kind of sacred cow of Yugoslav socialism. So one can say here's a film that dares make fun, play with, or make fun of that sacred cow, but certainly not in the sense which would anticipate, and yet indeed what would happen a few years later, that same Yugoslav People's Army would play an incredibly ugly role in the breakup of Yugoslavia. It would turn out it was one of the institutions of Yugoslav Brotherhood and Unity which turned out to be the ugliest institution.
Well, I finally understand why the army wanted to ban the film, you know.
Tell us a bit about that. There was a censorship issue.
Yugoslavia was this proud communist country of the so-called soft censorship. We were the best of communism, you know, in a way. We were better than our poor brothers in East Germany, Romania, Bulgaria, which I believe so was true on a level of getting a passport which was bigger price than black market. You know, we used to buy cheap sleeping bags from Czech people at the end of the summer because they really needed some money to buy a few jeans and go back to Prague, you know, or whatever. So in that type of life that was happening there, this kind of soft communism, censorship was very clever. There was no clashes. We didn't have people punished so often in some other countries. But I think it developed this kind of deeper understanding what is really dangerous, what's not dangerous. And I never thought that being a soldier who ran away from the barracks just because his girlfriend is trying to become the girl from the front page of some half-porn magazine would be enough reason. But it's true that the army actually wanted to ban the film, and bizarre thing is they actually said we will not ban the film, but we demand that we should cut out last two shots. And this is the first time I ever saw actually the film with the last two shots. And it's ridiculous actually. The shot with a jeep going down the street and that Žarko's hand falling down, and then the quote by probably the biggest punk poet of Yugoslavia, Branimir Štulić. These were two shots that should ban. I had to cut a person with scissors at the night of the opening. It was ridiculous back then, it's even more ridiculous now, but now it's kind of trying to understand the absurdity of it more than the harshness of it. And it also made me understand that we created this culture of false dissidents in the country back then. We had few right ones who really struggled, went to jail, had terrible life. I'm talking about atheism, I'm talking about Stalin and Goliath, you know, that stuff.
So the time of the film.
Yeah, of the time of the film. But we had this aura of those false dissidents, you know, people who were supposedly being chased by censors, but they lived in very nice places and really could publish anything, almost what they wanted. Of course, nothing was extremely either one or the other, but the presence of the army was this sense of we are one country, and army will never do wrong. You know, they may be a little stiff, they are not really there, but they understand people. They, you know, you can get drunk in the army, you can do this and that from time to time, not too often. But you cannot talk about God, you cannot talk about hating any other nation. So there was this proper conduct, and army was represented. And in a way, I think this film was touching all these subjects, again, trying to figure out an individual angle to all of it. I'm surprised how much aggression is there.
Well, I was just going to ask you about that. The film is, in some sense really brutal. It's very raw also. Maybe that's the right word, because aesthetically also it follows the theme, the milieu that it's depicting. And here I wanted to ask you to elaborate on that other, more macro but really crucial context for the film. And that's this, I mean, it's an urban film in a way, in the sense that it takes place in the city, but it's really about, and we're calling this event, Cinema at the Urban Edge. It's about the strata of the Yugoslav society, which in some sense, thematically, when it comes to cinematic work, cinematic representation thereof, is comparable to what Pasolini was doing with Roman Borgata, in the sense that here is a whole milieu which are not even the workers. These are the lumpen proletarians who don't work, and many of whom really don't even want to work. So there's a whole other set of ethical codes involved. Now through this group, however, and this is where I want you to elaborate, is this a kind of displaced, extreme manifestation nonetheless of what are generally social norms to be recognized as characteristic of this society at the time? There's a whole extreme degree of misogyny, of patriarchalism in the most brutal forms. So what were you thinking as you were depicting this milieu, and what, I mean, is the film, in your eyes, primarily a kind of representation of a youth subculture? Is it a social commentary type of film? How do you look at it now, whereas, you know, you made it 30 years ago, so it was a different time, different place.
I think you asked kind of more than one question.
Yeah.
So I think I can try to give a few words about raw. I think there is a contradiction there that I was aware of. It is raw in terms of depicting the street life, which I knew back then, which was much harsher actually than this. But the contradiction that I wanted here almost in an unnatural way to put some poetry there, because I understood that the street life was already glamorized. We became famous in Europe not because we were, I don't know, doing something very good in productive ways, but we had first bodyguard, you know, going to Paris to really kind of become famous. Starica Markovic was the street hero of Belgrade because he was a tough guy who can fight, but he had some ethical, you know, level there. So that contradiction was...
You're talking about criminals who made it abroad.
Yeah, and I'm talking about them becoming role models of society that was falling apart, because obviously the social and political levels did not really manage to produce anything else. So the street level, people became bigger, and the main character here is basically searching his way through it. And he has his own contradiction, because there is something rudimentary conservative in this whole film. And Belgrade, actually, in this film, is not an urban place. What we call suburban in our language, it's almost rural. These houses are falling apart. There is no sense of modernity there, you know. The shot I put with Uncle Dacia leaving at the end was one of those rare shots where we can see that Belgrade, which was building up, which was the 2 million town, urban center. But
right, modern Belgrade is always somewhere else, never
yes. But there is this almost insistence on traditional things. And strangely enough, I think the only person who is able to leave that whole area is a man who has nobody. Uncle Dacia, who is going back to this almost imaginary Israel, trying to go back to his roots that are not connected to anything else.
I wanted to ask you about his character, about the Jewish theme.
That was a real person, number one. You know, Jovan Erlich was a real soda pop guy who was very friendly with people I knew. He was not an invented character, but the story about the possibility of him being a father was absolutely fictitious. Fictional addition to it. I think I felt that part because it was pretty much a question about my own identity.
Kind of stretch between two fathers?
No, not two fathers, but two national identities, where one is representing one nation and the other one is representing the other. Being comfortable or uncomfortable being anything, including being Jewish. Back then when...
The real, or supposed, well, the father of the family, there is a very clear suggestion. It's at one point, and he's essentially Ibeowat. From back in 1948, he
was supporting Soviet Union, harsh politics against some kind of liberal Yugoslav politics, and in that sense, I think, insinuated that he probably went a couple of years to the naked island,
prison camp, anti-Stalinist.
Anti-Stalinist camp. And I think he represents this kind of completely lost, no guidance, no energy life. What struck me is how actually female characters are much stronger. Especially in this kind of anti-female environment, that absolutely the strongest woman is the mother, which I think also represents something that I grew up with, and something that I witnessed. I grew up in a house with very many apartments and a big backyard where we used to play soccer endlessly from the morning to the
Well, it's been kind of extremely patriarchal context, such as this. I mean, emasculation is always around the corner or there somewhere. And it happens in the film too, in some crucial scenes.
Yes.
So the main character who's kind of trying is at the same time, I guess, very representative of all this and trying to somehow find his way out of it. I wanted to ask you two questions, I'm sorry, before I open it to the audience. One is, there is nonetheless, clearly, not so much necessarily in the film, or which is to say in the milieu that is depicted amongst the characters, as in the style, the form of the film, and certainly when one knows the kind of production, the background of the film, there is an element of urban culture, Yugoslav culture at the time. After all, the music, which is still outstanding, I think, 30 years later, was composed by Vlatko Stefanovski, the leader of one of the most important rock bands at the time, Levi Soul, which is kind of bread and salt, I guess. How about the film influences, the visual influences?
First of all, let me try to answer this edge of urban.
Yes.
I think that urban Belgrade could not survive in this politically correct environment, so it had to search these decaying parts of Belgrade. And these are the true locations where some of the craziest things happened back in the 80s, which are in the heart of the city, but they were not under heavier control because they were falling apart. And this kind of urban guerrilla, which later on brought new music to some other cultural places, actually grew up or start growing up in places like that were depicted in the film. But film does not go deeper in urban because Belgrade already back then had huge movement which was European oriented around Studentsko Kulturni Center and places. But it was not for people like the main character of this film, who is struggling his life on a much more basic level. There is misery in this film, which kind of goes against urban, I would say.
But it's interesting, this is the phenomenon you describe. I mean, one thinks, like I said, one thinks of Pasolini, one thinks of Fassbinder, and also there are many European, it's not something unique to socialism either. There are many European filmmakers who have dealt with the urban in a manner where they link the two.
Fassbinder was always a big influence for me because of his raw energy, and this kind of unapologetic view of everything without really trying to present too many explanations. But I think I grew up between West and East. I was trying to make peace with American movies, and I was trying to make peace with some of the European movies. And in this film, I had a clear idea that I wanted to document, almost document, not stylize, any of the places people were in. And it struck me how really close even now. I was trying to find beauty in the ugly, in other words. That was,
and these locations are all real.
Yeah.
There's parts of Belgrade where it's shot, we know these streets, but actually some of them are still like that. You know?
well, I always visit my locations. I go to Belgrade twice a year at least. And I was there 2 weeks ago, and I always visit at least few of the locations, like her apartment, and that's still it.
Well,
Yeah, it's a little different, but it's still the same. It's the last candy store in Belgrade is like 10 meters from that entrance, and it's still there. You know, it's very
you mean like artisanal candy
Yeah.
store, yeah.
The place where Zarkov goes down trying to kill himself with that streetcar is absolutely the same. That little piece of it, behind it is different. So it didn't change much, and it's the heart of the city. It's really within the number 2, streetcar.
So the very narrow center of the city.
It was very narrow, yeah, but it didn't have this. I think it did not.
Nonetheless, a kind of isolated pockets.
Yeah. By the way, that house with the party was the first whorehouse in Belgrade ever. You know, it was there because the river was nearby, and it was, I guess, very functional. And that house, believe it or not, is now locked, but it's still there. The walls are almost falling apart, but no, not yet. They're probably going to make a big hotel now.
Somebody must have bought it and is thinking what to do.
Yeah.
I have one more question before we turn it to the audience, and that is, it's stunning how the fates of some of the actors, some of the protagonists in the film, the fate, what would befall them in the years to come. Namely, the 2 principal protagonists, Žarko Laušević, who plays Pavel, and Dragan Maksimović, who plays Whitey, the leader of the gang. Žarko Laušević, in the early 90s, was in a huge fight, I guess is not the word. He actually shot 2 people.
Yeah.
He ended up in jail. And on the other hand, Dragan Maksimović, in the 90s, correct?
No, actually, beginning of 20th
Beginning of,
century.
okay, so at the very beginning of the 21st century, in the middle of Belgrade, was killed by some hoodlums who attacked him thinking that he is a gypsy. There is a plaque actually, right, at the place where he was killed.
Yes, yes.
So
Well, I
it's
find
stunning.
of these 2, I find the second one, first of all, nothing was intentional, it's just how life interferes with the film of that side. I think what Marxa did, Whitey, for me, was terrible because I never really spoke with him a lot during the shoot. But after the film, we became very close. And we went to the city of Niš, which is the gypsy capital of
Southern Serbia.
yeah, ex-Yugoslavia. And actually, Marxa is from that area. And we were talking some religious subjects, the role of Judas in the life of Jesus, something like that. It was really all night long.
Ordinary conversation.
And he told me something. He said, part of me is a gypsy. And he said that not because it was almost obvious because his skin was much darker, but he said, I understand that, but that's my growing up. And when I heard that he was killed, I don't know if I should say, but I almost thought there is no future that can happen. Because he was a man of 50 kilos. He was skin and bones. he barely walked. He was a very asthmatic guy, you know. He was a drunk. He used to drink a lot, and he was not an easy person. But he was not a mean, aggressive guy in any sense.
Well, that horrific event was very much symptomatic of its times. And what was
he was dying for almost
rampant
2.5 months. He was dying in a hospital for almost 2.5 months. That body was really beaten to death, like terrible. But he never wanted to inform who killed him. And he died never saying who really killed him. And these people were never brought to justice, by the way, which is cynical as a result of it. But him saying, I don't want to die, knowing that I did something to make other people, you know, regardless of being killed, it's so almost saint-like, in this whole crazy circle of that he went through. So that struck me, actually, because with Žarko I'm very good friends, and I went through his tragedy very many times, and was involved when he was starting to write the books. So I know this story on a deeper level. It's a fate. It's a fate that there is beyond explanation. Zoran Amar,
who plays until the...
yeah, he
was one of
went
the
to the
foremost
hospital.
actors in Yugoslavia.
Well, this was his last shot. The way he waves his head was the last shot ever he shot in a film. We were all on the street. It was one of those moments why it's nice to make movies, you know. It was such silence. One take, no need for two. I never spoke a word with him. He would ask me, is this good? I said, of course it is. No, I did it not really that way, but he knew something I did not know. And part of it is that he knew that he was going to the hospital. He knew that he had cancer. So he was absolutely aware, I think, somewhere down. Some people in the crew told me that he spoke with them, but I didn't witness it, so I don't know. But that was a moment that even then looked as a transcendental, something that bridges a film. It becomes part of life. We talk about this interconnection. The kid with the handcuffs, the funny kid who is pushing the drinks.
The toothless kid, yes.
Yeah, who was one of the brightest acting talents, also died 2 years ago in misery. It's a sad, I mean, not only it's sad that it's 30 years later, but it's sad to see how something simply vanished without much trace.
Let's see if there are any questions from the audience. Yes, please.
Do you think with that, with several of the actors' tragedies, that it was a sign of the economy at the time? With this person, you know, these people ending their lives ending at a time like the person, the toothless person. Do you think it was a lot of it because he wasn't, it wasn't work?
I think he was extremely
unhappy.
Yeah, I think you are touching something that I don't know how brave I am to talk about, but I think that, including Marxa, the guy who looks like a gypsy who was killed, these were very unhappy people. They did not live a life that made them feel complete. Dragan Maksimović was in a Peter Brook film. He was in 50 films in Yugoslavia. He made bigger roles than this one, and his career was big, but he was not a happy person. He was very unhappy. Raca, the guy who was this toothless guy, was a minor character. He was always the most promising young actor who never did much. And that built this kind of feeling of failure. I saw him 6 or 7 years ago, last time. And he actually gave me a book for Žarko.
But there's something to be said when it comes to the casting of this film that I think is really one of the most interesting things. Žarko Ušević, the lead protagonist, aside, maybe. Both characters, actors you just mentioned, Maksimovic, Whitey, and Raca, who's one of his gang, are both very representative of, they're both what I guess you would call here character actors. None of them were stars. They didn't marshal the kind of star persona or status that you would associate with. They were big stars. Well, but they are cast here for their authenticity in a way. And they so well belong to
the... I mention my biggest influence, which was Godard, you know. That was the idea to work in documentary setting, but try to get these very strong character actors if possible, you know, because that's a contradiction that I was looking for. I was a big fan of Dragan Maksimovic as an actor before. I was very happy that he accepted to be in the film. Raca was in everything I did.
He was in every film you did. He was
Ratko
also...
Tankosic, who is an uneducated guy who plays the gypsy, Shuki, he was in everything I did. Everything, you know. The very famous guy who plays the photographer, poor guy who was really absolutely destroyed. His skin was bleeding heavily because Žarko hit him and he was really bleeding, and he said, "Don't stop the camera, it's gonna look good now." So he raised his head, and it's real blood, you know, this is nothing fake, because he had this kind of fancy wheel, and it had like a big, whatever, screw on it, and he did not really know how to hide. And Žarko didn't hit him strong, but he hit him, it's like a razor, so it was a lot about, he was in everything, but he never played anything big, you know, he was just there. And I'm very thankful because it's hard to make something work in 3, 4, 5 shots. I like those actors. I never thought, I only actually had a problem with Žarko.
During the shooting of this?
Yeah, the first choice was actually a different actor. Slavko Štimac, it was written for him. This girl, it was supposed to be Sonja Savić. It was written for them. It would be a different film, more her. That is my head. But I had producers who actually were very clear that they wanted it to be this way. So that's how. Yeah. I'm sorry I went around.
Oh, it's okay. I have one other question here that's slightly different. I noticed through the film that there were some times when it was just totally quiet. You didn't hear any background music. And maybe I'm just so used to a lot of other films having a lot of background music in between the dialogue. And was that on purpose?
I like silence. I have to admit, not complete silence. I think we did not have a way to test this stereo because we were rushing yesterday to make 5.1 surround sound. So this stereo is almost like double mono. So some things were lost, to be honest. But there are many, many places in the film where it's almost complete silence. Talking about another influence, I was always a big fan of Melville, you know, and I love silence. Because for me, without real silence, you don't have dynamic to go into very strong sound. People beat each other in this film in terrible sound. I stole all the sounds of all the beatings from Shane. I was 2 days in the room with a microphone, beating myself. I was blue, hitting, but it all looks like nothing. You know, you hit yourself, it's hurting you, but when you hear the sound, it's nothing. And it was for 2 days. I didn't know what to do, and in the end, I said, okay, let's steal it from Shane, because Shane had a famous fist fight, and it was a big job because it was optic sound, 35mm copy. So you have to create that optic out into magnetic. This is what I learned how to edit fights later on. I double the sound, then move one channel for 2 frames, so everything is a little pushed, you know. But that's another contradiction, you know. It almost looks like stylized. Some of these hits look almost unreal because They are too good. Some of it is the mix, but yeah.
Any more questions?
Did I exhaust you? I did exhaust. Please.
Just a simple clarification about the movie. At some point, the father is telling Pavel, or telling his friends, the gypsy, to disappear. Like,
Yeah.
what is he doing? But then they play the main part in the wedding party. I mean, the brother, the wife, so.
Yeah, but isn't that a contradiction that's actually on very many levels there? All of them have this emotional reaction which is very ugly first. But then after 15 seconds it didn't happen. He hits his own brother, then 10 seconds later father comes and says, welcome home. I think I find that authentic. I find that in the environment I was growing up, where you have a lot of shouting, you have a lot of beating, and also a lot of love. If something is Pasolini, that's definitely Pasolini. But what I think was happening there, people are not afraid to show their emotions, and their emotions are very aggressive.
Intense.
Yes.
We talked a lot about male actors. What happened to the female actors after your movie, the 30-year span? And I have a second question.
Well, I didn't ask, you mean about young girl, Maya?
All the girls,
Oh.
women actresses in your movie. That was the first part of my question. But the second one would be, there's this one scene when the main character, the girlfriend, was about to get raped. And she was already kind of like half a dress. I mean, she only had a little shirt on. I mean, why would she open? To me, all of a sudden, there's like a little bit of a cognitive dissonance when I saw her with this whitey, or Bailey, came in. Why would she open the door? She had like a little, I guess, peephole. For some reason, I had a little bit of a dissonance there, trying to understand why would she be in her underwear and opening a door to a guy that she knows it's aggressive.
So I should not explain because...
And then I'm just curious if you can tell me, first what happened to the actress, the second one, why would she open the door to somebody she didn't want to sleep with?
Well,
Being almost undressed.
I remember that. In my logic, she was waiting for Pavel to come. So that was the reason why the door... But I cut the opening when Whitey is coming in because I had that shot. I cut it out because I thought this will add a little bit more to this. Whitey is an evil guy. He has this third eye, in a way. If you remember from the first moment, he recognized Žarko in the train, leaves and come back. I thought that he has this, you know how evil people...
Sixth sense.
Yeah.
Third eye.
Yeah, but to go back to Maya, I was in Belgrade now, and she did a little interview because I will be making a Blu-ray, and 30 years later. She's still an actress. She's still an actress. She's in theater. She actually does a lot of documentary theater. She's traveling all over the world. She was in the States many times. She looks good for being 30 years later. The other girl that was almost raped in school, she has a boutique in New York. I don't think she's doing any acting. I will meet her soon because I want her also to say a few words.
The blonde lady.
Yeah.
Like the mom. The
Yeah.
blonde, blue-eyed lady. What happened to her? She seems so familiar.
The mom.
The mom?
The mom, Žarko's mom.
Žarko's mom was very kind of middle-known theater actress.
Is she still?
I liked her. Actually, I asked Zoran, who played Uncle Dutch. The only thing I asked him, would you be okay to act with her? And I'm going to cry now. He said, I always had a crush on her.
So your film was the act of faith.
Well, no, I think I understand now that kiss. And there was something very genuine for me. What he did, I think, it was part of their. She was a gorgeous woman when she was younger, very, very good looking. Yeah, there are two, actually another thing with him. We were looking for a costume and I had this old ladder, you know, for him to work in the soda pop bag. And I said, you know, you are Jewish, you have to wear some kind of kippah. And there was a gypsy guy, fat guy across the street, watching because actors are here, you know, people. Like in the film, when you see people on the other side of the street, that's exactly the whole shoot. They were there. I didn't even tell them you are on the camera, and it was because it looked real. I liked that back then. And Zoran said, what do you mean kippah? Hey, come here. So the guy comes here with this absolutely worn out cap, like completely sweaty, like 30 years old. He took it. What did he say? I think this is perfect, right? And it was, and that's the cap he's wearing. You know, that's so these were two things we did exchange. The actresses, I think the mother, as I said, the strength that she has. What made me choke a little bit tonight was when she said that line, I don't know who is his father. I just know he's mine. Very kind of traditional line, I would say, very almost 19th century line, but I think it represents that relationship. And I noticed, believe me, I never noticed after I made the film, that Paya, the father, when he pours the drink, he poured 3. Because it's probably that the dacha is gone. I guess that was in my head back then. But I never saw it after it. It was now, because the image was so sharp, it made me see that, yeah.
There was one more question there. Yes.
Hey.
Yes.
Okay. I was sort of, I guess I would say struck by the opening scene and the way in which it sort of, in a certain sense, seemed to be very aesthetically unique in comparison to the way that the rest of the film was shot. Particularly, I mean, you open with this sort of, truncated shot of the legs. We have this sort of, incredibly ordered space, this sort of row of Kalashnikovs, incredibly strong lighting, and the sort of almost bleached space that are empty. There's no no one's taking a shower. There's no one in the bathroom. And so I was sort of curious. I mean, in a certain sense, maybe when we move into this sort of suburban space, we see this sort of, at a distance, the, set of very sort of rectilinear buildings, or even some of the infrastructure, the sort of concrete flyovers, the buses or the trams that seem very clean, but the rest is sort of, it's gritty, as you were saying. So I was wondering, was there any sort of intentionality in sort of the way that you started the film? Why you sort of, I mean, because there is something sort of distinctive about the way that you shoot that first scene in relation to sort of the camera work, the lighting, the aesthetics of the later scenes, and that tension.
It must sound now that I'm rationalizing too much, because I don't think I was aware of it back then, but there was one thing that was very important for me, is to show the barracks. I served the army. As I said, I lost my best 11 months and 5 days of my life, meaning I was in the army 11 months and 5 days. But there is something fascinating in this man's world. And I thought, because he's, as a guard, he's supposed to check everything. Let me open, putting more emphasis on the environment, on the setting than on him, because his time is coming. And let me see his face when we see first the girl, and that was the little narrative that I was running in my head, because then we're going to pick up. But the barracks, it's exactly how I remember the army. Like, why is the water running? Right? You understand? Because there are too many people jerking there in the back. So you don't have to hear that. You need to cover these things and stuff like that. which I don't want to show on any other level, but just as a reality of the barracks. You know, when you spend a night with 30 people in a room for 12 months, you know, it's a different understanding of life. It really is. And it changes. I mean, I don't know anybody who served the army who didn't say that it changed his life. And it was just a setting to put in the whole story and then move on. But I like long shots, you know. I always was trying to juxtapose the long and the short. I think. I don't know. I mean, I was not bored, to be honest. I personally thought that my question is always, is there energy there? Actually, that's my main question. Is there energy there 30 years later? Of course, I like it more than anybody else because I made it, but at the same time, you know, is that energy, even for me, still alive? I'm going to go now tonight home and probably think even more. I didn't feel good all the way, but some moments I did, some moments I did. But thank you for coming here.
Zoran, thank you so much.
Almost
for being our guest.